Hi, everybody. In this lecture, I'd like to introduce you to poetic form and talk about what exactly we mean by poetic form, and then give you some tools for understanding form when you read poetry for this class or anywhere else for that matter. The first thing we need to do is talk about form. What is form? Okay, and I want us to keep in mind as we dive in here that whenever we're talking about literature and about poetry, especially, the key question we want to ask is how does a poem, how does a work of literature, how does a work of art make meaning? All right. And one of the key things to keep in mind is that form is one of the key ways that literature, especially poetry, makes meaning. Okay. And whenever we talk about poetry, whenever we talk about literature, we always want to be thinking about what the effects are of different formal choices of different types of literature. Okay, so always think about effects and how do the different aspects of form that I'm going to talk about create different effects for a reader. All right. So form, to define it, is everything about a poem that is not the meaning of the words. That is, it's everything that's not the content of the words. Okay. And perhaps an easy way to think about it is if you didn't speak the language the poem is written in, okay, but you only had it in front of you and had it read to you in a language you didn't understand, form would be everything that you could observe and notice about that poem when you don't understand the language it's written in, okay? So form can include the rhythms of the words, the rhythms of the language. It can refer to the sound of the words, the sound of the language, and you can think about things we've already talked about, like rhyme and alliteration and other features of sound. Those are all aspects of form. You might think about lines and line endings, line lengths, line breaks. Those are all part of form as well. They are part of how the form looks on the page, which is another component of form, right? The arrangement of the words on the page, literally what it looks like on the page, is part of the form of a poem, how it looks. And when we think about form, we can also think about any patterns we notice about any of these things above, right? So when we notice certain patterns in the rhythm and sounds of a poem, or certain patterns in the length of the line, or in the way that lines are broken at the end, all of that is part of form. Okay, and we can actually use our observations of all and any of these things to get more specific about poetic form. Okay, and there are two broad categories of form when we get to talking about poetry, right? Closed form and open form. And we're going to talk about these in turn. Okay, closed form essentially refers to poetry that follows established rules. Okay. And then open form, as you might guess, refers to poetry that doesn't follow established rules, that makes up its own kind of rules as it goes along. Let's talk about each of these in turn. Closed form, that would be poems with definable rules. I want to talk about what I mean by rules in a second, but before I do that, I want to just take a moment to talk about why closed form, right? Because people might be thinking, and in fact, poets, more modern poets have often thought, aren't rules boring and constraining? Shouldn't poetry just be, what's in your heart, right? And shouldn't poetry be free? But I'd like to maintain, I would like to argue that poetic closed form, that is, poetry that follows definable rules, and there are lots of different kinds of rules and conventions we could be talking about here. Um, uh, is not stifling or it doesn't work against creativity and authenticity, right? And in fact, let me just use some examples and some questions to help you think about this. Um, if you like sung music, right, then you like closed form. In fact, if you like most popular forms of music, then you actually like closed form yourself. That is, you like the fact that music has discernible, predictable rhythms and that follow certain patterns. It's part of what gives the pleasure of music and popular music, particularly. Okay. If you like to play or watch games or sports, then you probably also like closed form. Okay, because games and sports are defined by their rules and conventions, right? That's what actually defines the game, the rules and conventions that make it the game. And you could ask yourself, do the rules and conventions of your favorite musical genre or songs bore you, or do they crush the artist's expressive ability? Probably the answer is no. I don't think most of us would think that just because our favorite, band or our favorite group might sing songs and create music that follows certain repetitive sounds and rhythms, that crushes their creativity or their ability to express themselves. I'd also ask, do the rules or conventions of various games and sports stifle creativity, individuality, or even greatness? Um, and of course, I think we just think about that for a second and we say no, right? You can think about something like chess. I can think of no other game that is more rule bound than chess. It's mathematical in its rules, for goodness sake, right? But I don't think anybody would say that Gary Kasparov or Magnus Carlsen, two world champions, right, aren't deeply creative or passionate about what they do, and aren't great at that game. And you could extrapolate and say the same thing about baseball, right? I mean that's governed by rules. You've got Hank Aaron, who just passed away recently, a great player, and Babe Ruth of yore, right? These are people who made names for themselves and showed great talent, passion, and creativity and individuality, even though they were playing games that were bound by particular rules, right? Michael Jordan and LeBron James aren't less great in their sports, in basketball, for example, because basketball is bounded by specific sets of rules. Okay. Rules and conventions can serve many purposes in games, music, poetry, and other art forms. And rules and conventions in art actually can connect artists and also us, those that look at art and behold art, to traditions. And then that in turn can bind human beings across time, which I think is a pretty cool thing. What I mean by that is that an artist who is working in, oh, I don't know, the epic form, right? A poet who's working in the epic form, by working in the epic form, is at least implicitly participating in a tradition that includes people like Homer, like Virgil, the great Roman poet, like Dante, like John Milton. Okay, and in a strange way, participating in such an art form with a long tradition behind it, allows us in some very rich way to connect to those who have gone before us. Okay. Anyway, that's my brief for closed form. Now let's talk about closed form in more detail and what we mean by it and some of the vocabulary we can use to talk about it. Closed form refers to poems written with very regular and very often named patterns or rules. And these can include rules and conventions about line lengths or rhythms of lines, rhyming patterns, and so on. All right. Um, Two very common things that we will talk about with closed form is metrical lines. That is, lines that have a very clear, predictable pattern of line length and rhythm. And we've talked a little bit about that in a previous lecture, where we can actually name various line types by the type of metrical foot that they are made up of and the number of feet in that line, right? So it means something very specific to say that a poem is written in, say, iambic pentameter, or that a poem is written in trochaic tetrameter, right? Those are actually very clear, descriptive names of lines which have rules that govern them, as we've seen in the previous lecture. We can also talk about rhyme scheme, that is, the patterns of end rhymes in a poem or in a stanza of a poem. We can note that often poems in various types of closed form have predictable rhyme schemes that we can schematize with just letters, for example, showing what the pattern of end rhyme is in the poem. All right. There are different commonplace names of forms that refer to how lines are grouped together and organized in a poem. So when you have a poem written in couplets or a stanza written in couplets, couplets are pairs of lines that work as a unit. You can have poems that are written in tercets, which are trios of lines that work as a unit. That would be groups of lines of three. Okay. And those are often connected just visually by being broken up into stanzas of three lines. You can have quatrains, again, which is a stanza form, meaning quartets or groups of four lines that work as a unit, right? And those are often visible on the page by being separated by line spaces, okay? And often couplets and tercets and quatrains, those groups of two and 3 and 4 lines also, not always, but may also quite often have a particular rhyme scheme that groups them together. So, for instance, couplets that rhyme are called rhyming couplets, and the number of poetic genres throughout the ages, you'll have poems written with that kind of pairs of end rhymes, right? Um, Tercets may have a rhyme scheme that alternates in some interesting ways, and quatrains may have a particular rhyme scheme that repeats. You can read more details about that in your chapter. That will give you plenty of examples of these. We can talk about stanzas, which are simply a stanza refers simply to a group of lines that are visibly separated on the page by line spaces. And then there are certain terms that might refer to the way an entire poem is written. So, for example, terza rima, it's an Italian term, refers to a poem written in tercets that rhyme in a very particular way. They follow a particular set of rules. Dante's Divine Comedy is written in terza rima, for example, and you'll read some poems this week that also are written in terza rima. Your book will identify them for you. And then, of course, in English, we have blank verse. Blank verse is lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter, and it is probably best known to us from the plays that were very popular in the Renaissance period in English, Shakespeare being the most obvious example. But blank verse has an old and rich history in English, simply refers to any poem that is written in lines of iambic pentameter, right? So 5 iambs per line. So da 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 da, and they are unrhymed. There is no end rhyme in them. Okay, that's blank verse. Okay, and those are just some terms, right? But those are major ones that you should be familiar with. Um, Closed form can also refer to types of poems which are identified by their specific sets of rules and conventions, right? So some examples will help illustrate what I mean. So we say that a poem is written in closed form. Sometimes that can actually refer to the fact that a poem is a certain kind of poem, like a ballad, for example. A ballad is a poem that tells a story, and in English poetry, a ballad not only tells a story, but it is written in a certain form, usually in quatrains, and those quatrains rhyme typically A, B, C, B, or A, B, A, B, and those lines have a length of 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8 syllables, and 6 syllables. And again, your chapter will give you more details on this. I just want to kind of whet your appetite for that. And when we use letters like this to refer to a rhyme scheme, what we're saying is A, B, C, B, that we have a 4-line stanza, and the second and fourth lines rhyme with each other, and they rhyme together, and the first and third lines have different sounds at the end of those lines, so they don't rhyme. Okay, and in this case, this would refer to a stanza that's of 4 lines where the first and third lines rhyme with each other, and the second and fourth lines rhyme with each other. That's what we mean by those letters, right? So a stanza written in A, B simply means lines 1 and 3, they rhyme at the end, and lines 2 and 4 rhyme at the end. And then this simply refers to the number of syllables, not feet, but syllables in the line. Okay. We have the epigram and the ode. Those are two types of poems that came to us from ancient Latin and Greek poetry. You've actually seen the epigram, I believe, or you will see the epigram. The ode is a different kind of form. I don't expect you to know an ode, but I just wanted to give you some, whet your appetite for these things. We have the haiku, which we have seen, right? That's a 3-line poem with a certain syllable count that focuses on a particular image. We've got a bunch of forms in English that we stole from French, the rondo, the villanelle, and the sestina, which is possibly one of the most difficult forms to write in. And they all have rules. You could actually describe each of these types of poems with a rhyme scheme, for example, which would tell us, oh yeah, that's that kind of poem, all right? But again, I'm not going to go into detail in this lecture. Your book will give you some examples, and you will read you'll read a rondo, I believe, and a sestina in your chapter. And then we have like the limerick, uh, imported from Irish poetry, no doubt. And of course, we probably associate limericks with often dirty or bawdy kinds of rhymes, right? There once was a man from Boston, and so on. And we have other kinds of forms like the acrostic, for example, which is a poem where you take, say, take your name and you write your name down in a column, and then each letter then you write a line beginning with each letter of your name, creating a line from each letter of your name. So if you have a 6-letter name, you'd have a poem of 6 lines, with the leftmost letters spelling your name from top to bottom, and then you'd have 6 lines, right? That's an acrostic. And there are lots of other closed forms that have names. These are just among the most obvious or the most popular. I don't mean popular like more people love them, but generally speaking, historically, poets have favored these forms, right? These are particular forms. Now, there's one form I didn't mention, and the reason I didn't mention is because I want to talk about it all by itself, and it will be the one poetic form that I am going to expect you to talk about and know the rules for. All right? I think it's fair because it is such a popular form, and I don't want you to memorize the rules for like all these forms at all, but I think it's fair to have you memorize the basic rules for this form, and that is the sonnet. Yes, yes, the sonnet. A poem that you might associate immediately with, I don't know, someone like Shakespeare, or with love, or with, I don't know, highfalutin English written with these and thous. And you wouldn't be wrong for those associations. But let's talk about the sonnet, okay? One of the most popular and enduring closed forms in English, and in fact in lots of European languages. The sonnet, briefly, by history, was basically invented by Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet, the Florentine poet, who wrote the Divine Comedy in the Middle Ages. He wrote a series of sonnets to his the great love of his life, Beatrice, right? Beatrice, whom he also meets in paradise in the Divine Comedy. Another Italian poet named Petrarch, Francesca Petrarca, refines the sonnet, and he creates a whole series of poems called the Rime Sparse, which is Italian for scattered rhymes, and it's a collection of more than 100 sonnets, all written, or mostly written, to a woman that he met once on a Good Friday afternoon named Laura, and fell madly in love with. There was only one problem. He was a priest and she was married to somebody else. Well, I guess it's 2 problems. Nonetheless, he wrote these beautiful poems to her, and then when she died of the Great Plague, the Black Death, in 1348, he continued to write sonnets, which then turned to heavenly love, not only to Laura, but to the Virgin Mary. So Petrarch became insanely popular, so popular that by the 15th and 16th centuries, Petrarch's Rime Sparse were translated into just about every European language you could think of. And then he was imitated. Everyone who was a poet at some point writes a sonnet, and that's probably true to this day. At some point, you try your hand at a sonnet. Okay. One thing to note is that the sonnet was a popular form that was one of the first in European culture that was thought to be okay to be written in your native language. You didn't have to write it in Latin or Greek. Dante wrote them in Italian, or Florentine Italian at the time, and so did Petrarch. The sonnet often is associated with erotic love, or maybe the love of the ideal woman in particular, okay? They were often written in groups or cycles. So quite often you didn't just write a single sonnet, you would write a whole collection of sonnets that, although they didn't go together as one poem, they often kind of told or implied a story, as kind of a set of lyrics together. They're often dramatic and feature a poetic speaker that's quite immediate, right? Often addressing the object of his affections in direct, intimate terms, and they will often pose a dramatic situation or possibly a problem that the speaker wants to try and figure out related to love or his attraction to his lover. And as a result of their form, we're going to look at their form carefully in just a second. They're incredibly flexible. They are individual lyrics that can stand on their own, but they can also be woven together to imply a larger narrative, as I just suggested, with the idea that sonnets were often written in cycles or large sets. And they involved a tight set of rules that they were demanding, but they weren't terribly demanding, okay? There are other closed poetic forms in English in English in particular, that are far harder, like the sestina, for instance. but they're demanding enough that they pose a challenge for the poet, but they also permit a wide range of flexible possibilities. Now let's take a look at the two major forms of the sonnet. Okay, these are traditionally the two basic forms of the sonnet, and I do want you to know their two sets of rules. This is all fair game for quizzing and exams, okay? I just think it's something cool and important to know coming out of a literature class. Like, yeah, hey, you remember learning about a sonnet in English. And there are two types. The first type, there are two types in English. First is the Italian sonnet or the Petrarchan sonnet. And yeah, that probably tells you where it came from, right? This is the sonnet form that Petrarch, that was derived from Petrarch's Rime Sparse, okay? It's 14 lines. And in English, those 14 lines are generally in iambic pentameter. So you have 5 iambs together in a line. Da-da, 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 right? Iambic meaning the iamb, and pentameter meaning there are 5 of them in a line. So 14 lines of iambic pentameter. And they're broken up into 8 lines, which is called an octave, 8, which will always rhyme in an Italian sonnet, A, B, B, A, B, B, A. Kind of challenging because that means uh, you've got to make two different rhymes 4 times, right? So you've got 4 rhymes that are A, and then 4 rhymes that are B. Okay, so Italian Petrarchan sonnet, an octave that rhymes A B B A, A B B A, and then a set of 6 lines which rhyme with, they have varying patterns, but they can often be C D E C D E or even C D C D C D, and there are other variations, but the key way to tell a Petrarchan or an Italian sonnet is you've got an octave of 8 lines that generally rhymes A, B, B, A, B, B, A. Okay. And then this 2-part organization of 8 lines and 6 lines um, usually means that there's some kind of turn, or in Italian, the volta, around line 9. So the first 8 lines will often pose like a situation or potentially a problem or a theme, and then the sestet will represent maybe a solution to that problem or a turn of thought to a different approach to that theme, right? Or a change of attitude towards that theme. So that's an Italian sonnet. We're going to look at one in a second just to see how it plays out. And then you have the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet. This kind of sucks because the English sonnet was not invented by Shakespeare. But of course, like all things Shakespearean, he just sucks all the air out of the room. This sonnet form was actually invented in English by the Earl of Surrey, who lived before Shakespeare by quite a bit, but Shakespeare hogs all the credit. So the English sonnet is also called the Shakespearean sonnet. It is also 14 lines, iambic pentameter. So you can see here, a sonnet is always 14 lines in these strict forms. Okay, 14 lines, iambic pentameter, and you'll see the difference here. An English sonnet has 3 quatrains, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then a final rhyming couplet that rhymes G, G. So contrast that with the Petrarchan sonnet, which is broken up into 8 and 6. The Shakespearean or English sonnet doesn't have that 8 and 6. It has more like 3 quatrains and then a couplet at the end. And then if there is a turn, like a volta, it would often happen in the couplet. There's a surprising turn that happens at the end, a surprising insight or something in those last 2 lines quite often. And then sometimes in an English sonnet, you'll have between the quatrains like little turns or progressions of thought between these 3 quatrains. All right, and we're going to take a look at one of these in a second too. Please note a couple things in general, right? Poets will riff on these forms quite a lot. All right, as you can imagine, a good artist may pick a form, or a good poet that wants to write in closed form. They want to write a sonnet, but they're not going to follow this slavishly. They're going to play some variations on a theme. Occasionally, you'll see a poet write a sonnet with 12 lines, which is kind of surprising. Or occasionally, like in the case of Robert Frost, they might add some lines to it. But 14 lines is the basic form. Okay, and there'll be riffs on these different formal rules as well. All right, because artists love to push the boundaries and create new forms within forms that they have received, and they try to transform them. And so these rules define a pattern, right? So it's an identifiable pattern, but good artists are by no means straitjacketed into always following exactly these patterns. There will be variations. Nonetheless, it's important to kind of know the basic rules, okay? One other thing to notice is that even though these things will break down into, say, a group of 8 lines and 6 lines in an Italian sonnet, and 3 quatrains in a couplet in an English sonnet, those aren't always visible on the page, and you'll see what I mean in just a second. Right? They're not always like visually broken up into those groups. So here, let's take a look. First, an English sonnet, because it's more familiar to us. And you'll notice this is by Shakespeare. This is sonnet 116. I'm just going to read it to you. Listen, pay attention, see if you can see that pattern here, right? 14 lines, 3 quatrains rhyming this way with a final rhyming couplet, okay? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So note, you've got that rhyme scheme, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. You're going to say, wait, come and doom don't rhyme. Yeah, in the way English was spoken at Shakespeare's time, come and doom would have been a rhyme. So that kind of clues you into the fact that language changes sounds over time. So that would have been an exact rhyme in Shakespeare's time. Proved and loved would probably also have been an exact rhyme. Today we would call these, we might call these approximate rhymes. So they kind of rhyme, they're close enough, so we'd still consider them following the basic rules here. But there you have it, a pretty prototypical Shakespearean or English sonnet. 3 quatrains, a rhyming couplet at the end that kind of makes the whole thing snap closed like a nice little box. And it follows that iambic pentameter over 14 lines with that set rhyme scheme. Now let's look at an Italian sonnet. This is by Edna St. Vincent Millay, all right? Notice the Petrarchan rhyme scheme, and in this case she does show us the break between the octave and the sestet. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight, that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply, and in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads, that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone, I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. All right, so notice, again, 14 lines, iambic pentameter. Notice the rhyme scheme here. A, B, B, A. So Y rhymes with sigh, and lane and rain rhyme together. Then reply and cry also rhyme with sigh and Y. That's why it's A, B, B, A, B, B, A. And then pain and again rhyme with lane and rain. In British English, this again would sound very close to this. So it would be pain and again, right? But we'll still consider it an approximate rhyme. So that's B, B. And then we have the break. Here's the octave. Then the sestet here, where we'll notice we have a different rhyme scheme, okay? And we'll also notice that these 6 lines sort of provide an analogy, a metaphor here, that the speaker is like a lonely tree that is no longer in summer, but now in winter, and remembers the lovers of the past up here. But now this is analogized to a tree. And so they work in a different way. We could talk for days about the different ways these poems mean, but I want you just to see those different deployments of the sonnet form. Okay, so remember, sonnet form you're responsible for. I do expect you to know and to be able to define the rules of an Italian sonnet and an English sonnet. Okay, so what about open form? We've talked about closed form and given the example of the sonnet as a case study. Well, what about open form? As you might imagine, open form, unlike closed form, breaks rules, or doesn't really care about established rules. And open form really starts to come into its own from, say, the middle of the 19th century onward in English. For most of literary history, poets have written in various types of closed form, right? But in the past century and a half, open form, or what we call free verse, has been in the ascendancy, and it's the dominant form and has been now for a number of generations. There are plenty of poets today that have rediscovered and that are interested in writing in various closed form, but free verse or open form tends to be more of the mainstream today. Um, Walt Whitman in American literature is probably the main figure that gives us this free break from closed forms of the past and gives us the open form, the free verse. And it's not surprising that Walt Whitman is often associated with American democracy, right? The freedom from the forms of the past. So free verse has no set pattern or set of rules or conventions governing the poem. So a poem is written in free verse. You know it's in free verse because there really isn't a clear metrical pattern, and you're not really noticing set rhymes or clear patterns at all that pertain to the entire poem. However, that doesn't mean that free verse doesn't seek out its own form. Free verse often invents its own form as it goes along. So it won't have metrical regularity. So you're in a free verse poem, you're not writing in iambic pentameter or a nameable form like that. And if you're writing a rondo or a sonnet or a villanelle, you're not writing in free verse, you're writing in a closed form. Nonetheless, free verse, when you're writing a poem in free verse, you do have a form sort of invents itself from the inside out, sometimes with the poet's conscious will and sometimes without the poet's conscious will. So here are some of the tools of free verse. Here are some of the patterns that free verse can create, or some of the features free verse can take advantage of as you're writing a poem, or as a poet is writing a free verse poem. A free verse poet is probably paying attention to line length and line breaks. That's a key component, right? Um, it's not necessarily going to establish a rule, right, or follow a convention, but it's going to play around with line length and line breaks to help make meaning. Okay. Um, when you're reading a free verse poem, you might notice the relation between line length on the one hand, like where lines are broken at the end, and the sentences or ideas in the poem, right? Where is a poet breaking those lines compared to where the sentences begin and end? You might look at the spacing between lines and among lines. You might pay attention to the sounds and rhythms, not just the repetition of them, although a free verse poem might repeat certain patterns. But what do you make of the sounds and rhythms? So you'll want to open that toolbox from the last lecture or two where we address sound and rhythm. And even how the poem looks on a page, right, as part of a free verse poem. So let me give you some tips for reading open form or free verse poetry, and then we'll look at two examples just to see how this works in practice. So when you're reading an open form poem, right, when you can tell that it's not written in a clear meter or a closed form, then you know you're probably reading an open form poem or a free verse poem. So read aloud, listen, and enjoy. Of course, you do that with every poem, whether it's closed form or not. I don't care if it's a sestina or a sonnet or free verse. Read a poem out loud, listen to it, and enjoy it. Then, especially if you're dealing with a free verse poem, observe the poem and mentally list what you see, what you hear. And then you can ask yourself the following sorts of questions. What about line lengths in general? Are the lines short? Are they longish? Where do you see line breaks happening? Do line endings interrupt sentences and phrases? Because there is a different effect. If you have sentences that end with lines that end at the end of lines, that creates a different effect from a poem where the lines are broken in the middle of sentences and sentences spill over into subsequent lines. Right, it's a different effect. You might ask, how do the line breaks connect to what the poem says? What other non-metrical and non-rhyming elements do you notice? Think about sound or imagery or different kinds of repetition, or think about spacing. Remember, the poet isn't hiding the poem from you. Okay, reading a poem isn't an act of using your secret decoder ring to guess the super secret meaning that the poet has hidden and encrypted for you. The poem is right in front of you. The poet doesn't want to hide the poem. But there it is in front of you. So experience the poem, just like you'd experience a song or a painting. And yes, of course, eventually you want to start talking about what you think a poem means. but that comes through understanding how the poem makes meaning, through understanding what it's doing and the effects it's creating. And you can always ask, why did the poet arrange the poem this way rather than that way, a different way, right? The poet got to choose everything in a free verse poem, right? Unlike a poet writing in a sonnet where a number of formal choices are already made, and you have to work within those formal choices, a free verse poet, they choose everything, right? So why do they do it that way rather than another way? Let's take a look at two examples, all right? Here is a poem by E. E. Cummings, who did not like capitalization even in his own name, or shall I say, liked to buck the conventions of written English. Look at this poem before we even read it. Clearly, he's playing around with spacing. He's playing around with what it looks like on the page. He's playing around with capitals. Look at that. He's playing around with spacing between words. So we can tell without even reading the poem, just by looking at the form, that Cummings likes to play around with poetry and how it appears on the page. We probably imagine that he's going to play around with different effects of rhythm with this because just how it looks on the page. All right. So I'm going to read this poem, and you just listen to it, experience it, and we'll go from there. Buffalo Bill's defunct, who used to ride a water smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? Now, again, I'm not going to have too much to say about this because I want you to listen to it and feel it and think about what you observe, okay? But hopefully my reading there helped bring out some meaning, helped you create some more observations about what's going on in this poem. And even just observing that E. E. Cummings is really playing around with the way words look on a page and how they're spaced and how those different spacings create different rhythms. Um, that's that's doing some good work, even if you observe that, right? So there's a lot more we could say about that poem and how it's creating meaning. Let's look at one more, and then we'll be finished. This is by William Carlos Williams. It is a poem, what we call an ekphrastic poem. Ekphrasis means you are sort of translating one art form into another art form, and particularly writing a poem about a picture. This poem is in reference to this painting by Bruegel, okay, called The Kermis, which is clearly a picture about a bunch of peasants, villagers, really drunk on probably some good beer, dancing around. Listen to this. This is a free verse poem, but ask yourself about line lengths, ask yourself about line endings, and see if you can feel any rhythms that Williams is inventing with this free verse poem. In Bruegel's great picture, The Kermis, the dancers go round, they go round and around, the squeal and the blare and the tweedle of bagpipes, a bugle and fiddles tipping their bellies, round as thick-sided glasses whose wash they impound, their hips and their bellies off balance to turn them, kicking and rolling about the fair grounds, swinging their butts. Those shanks must be sound to bear up under such rollicking measures, prance as they dance in Bruegel's great picture, The Kermis. Again, there's lots we could say about this poem, but hopefully you heard the lumbering and even staggering dancing of the poem. You could hear there's kind of a semi-regular rhythm going on, but it's not, it's not metrical in the sense that we could name every single line clearly as a certain kind of metrical line. But what you probably noticed is the way that Williams uses line endings and caesurae, or pauses in the lines, to create a certain stumbling, um, possibly even drunken dance, right? Kind of like these peasants. We would probably say, listening to this poem, that it's not about ballerinas that are fleet of foot and graceful, right? This is not a graceful dance. This is a regular but lumbering, staggering kind of dance with great fun happening with booze, okay? So there's more we could say about that, but Williams uses and invents his own form in free verse to create a certain set of effects here, okay? So remember, whether a poem is an open form or in closed form, the poet, the artist, is choosing their form or their lack of form to create certain effects. and they are playing with form to create an original work, even if they're writing in closed form, where they're participating in a form that has a history. They're still choosing what they're doing consciously to create certain effects, in the same way that Bruegel made choices to produce this wonderful painting that you see here.